Hi guys, and welcome back. Today I'm working on a little Copic marker illustration, and today I want to talk just a little bit about some of the differences that I've noticed with the two and some of the things that I'd like to focus on going forward. So I usually use watercolors lately for my traditional stuff, but I used to do a lot more Copic markers. That used to be my main traditional medium. And I do not think that I was ever actually good at it or competent even. I managed with them, but once I've come back to them, like for this specific piece, I've realized how much more control and understanding I have for colors thanks to watercolors. When I used to do lots more Copic markers, I do remember really struggling to get the colors that I want, and they used to be very flat because I was very stuck in a mindset of coloring and shading with the same color, family. So it was very flat, like I said. But once I've gotten into watercolor and you really learn about glazing, that's encouraged, and putting different colors on top of each other to find out what it looks like. When I worked on this piece, I found myself experimenting a lot more with different layerings of different colors than I ever have before with my markers. And I think that that is a big part for me being able to get more out of these markers, because watercolors, I can mix them pretty much infinitely. There is a limit on how saturated they are, but ultimately I can mix what I need. I can combine different paints to get exactly what I want, but markers, I am limited to what color the marker is itself. So when I was used to using it, I did feel very pent in with that. But now that I have a better understanding of how to combine them to create different effects, I think that that range of colors that I do have is going to go a lot farther than it ever has for me in the past. But I can talk a little bit about the tools that I'm using. So as always, I'll have a link in the description. But most of my markers come from the B set, I believe. I have Sketch B set markers. And I'm also using Bristol board for the paper and microns for the ink. So I would love to hear your guys' suggestions on the paper to use. I know everyone has their own personal preference, but I've never really quite found that perfect paper that solved all the issues that I have with markers. I do end up going to Bristol board quite often. I do actually like how thick it is. It can be really drying on the marker, so it can be hard to get very smooth coats, and it can make your markers run out a lot faster. So it definitely has its downsides, but the fact that it is thick and it does absorb the ink does allow me to do a lot more layers and blend things a lot easier than other papers. So far Bristol board is still my favorite for markers, but I'm definitely open, especially going forward, to trying to do more markers. I think that I would really like to experiment with the different types of paper. So yeah, let me know in the description, or not the description, the comments, if you guys have any favorite marker papers. But I use microns like I normally do with my watercolors, but this time it was very smeary. I know that when I did Copics before, I feel like the microns were usually pretty solid once they were there. I can't actually remember. It's been so long, so I'm not sure if they're just reactivated from the Copics, but I have a sneaking suspicion that I just did not wait long enough for the ink to be fully absorbed into the paper. So with watercolors, my paper is obviously intended to absorb water. It's very wicking on what I put down. So the microns, when I use it on my watercolor paper, it's pretty much instantly ready to be painted on top of. But for this one, I immediately got streaks. I did let it sit for maybe like 15 minutes, which was definitely not enough time. And it was really frustrating to watch these little dots of ink that I'd put just smear right into her skin tone. But it was a good reminder that I can't go from one medium to the other and have everything work the exact same way. But I did end up sitting it down for a couple of hours, letting the ink just sit there and absorb into the paper, and I did get a lot better, but not perfect. So I think in the future for these, I'm really gonna have to think ahead a little bit more and let them sit for a lot longer than I have for my watercolors. That is, I'm going to have to be prepared to let it sit, which is definitely something that I could do more of. I have a problem of just going from one step to the next, and then just plowing through a piece without taking time to think about it and analyze what I can do with it. So it certainly won't be a bad thing to make myself pace down a little bit. But yeah, I would definitely recommend if you're using microns and Copic markers and Bristol board, let the microns sit a little bit longer on your paper to make sure that it is absolutely absorbed. What I actually should have done is I did have a little sheet of Bristol board next to me that I was using for little color testing and layering colors. I should have had my micron on there, and then I could have come back and tested it to make sure it was in fact completely Copic proof before I even started touching the final. And one thing that I really enjoyed when I colored this piece, and by no means do I think I was particularly successful at it, I just like that it was a detail that I'm finally starting to remember to put into my pieces, but I love rim lighting. And that's where light is hitting a character from basically behind, so the edge of them is highlighted. I love the look of it, and I always do it in my watercolors, or not my watercolors, my digital pieces, but with my digital ones I do all the lighting at the very end, so I'm able to add that rim lighting without even it being an issue. But when it comes to watercolors or Copic markers in this case, I have to be thinking about it from the very beginning, because watercolors and Copic markers, they're both light to dark mediums, which means you have to start with light colors first and then darken it as you go. So I need to like have those highlights in there from the beginning. And I always struggle with it with watercolors where I paint over it and I lose that highlight. So I have to go back in and add it manually with the gouache sometimes, and it just doesn't have that same quality. So for this one, I was trying to be very thoughtful about it, and I actually do think that it was at least somewhat of a success. It added more dimension to the piece, and it really did have the effect that I was looking for. So I'm excited about that. I'm starting to get a handle on how to actually enact that and make it happen, how to blend the colors together. So what I actually did was I had the rim lighting on the right side of her face, so I just took the marker, and it's pretty obvious, but I took it around that edge where that rim lighting would be, and then I took a very light marker and just blended around that gap that it had, so that there was a little bit more of a mesh between the main local color and the highlight, so it wasn't just this stark line, but it did still have a much lighter value next to it. And then when I got to the skull, this part was one that I did not plan out at all. So it was a little bit of a leap of faith, but I'm really happy with the way that it turned out. This is one of the areas that I really pushed the varieties of colors that I had in it. And I think that it was my favorite part of this piece, actually, where I do end up going in with like a very purple for the shadows, and then more of a green for the general highlights, and then a blue for these mid-tones. And again, that's something that I've really struggled with in the past to get into my Copic markers, of having varieties within the colors within the same objects. So being able to get that in a way that has a little bit more life to it like this, it was really exciting. It did open up doors, and it makes me think more options of how I can actually color things so that there's more variety and more interest and more dimension to it, rather than things being as static. But yeah, that was the area that I did not plan, but I did have my scrap sheet of paper next to me where I would layer each color on top of the next so that I could make sure that it would have the correct look that I want. Because I did test out a few that were just not quite right. They did turn a weird shift to the color. So I did make sure that I chose a very cool colored purple. That way it would blend as best with that blue as possible. And then I did also make sure that when I was going over back with the green to blend the green in with the blue, I didn't overlap that purple, because it did create a look that I didn't want anymore, and it did actually start breaking down the purple. That is something to be aware of actually with Copic markers, is that if you put a much lighter color of ink over a much darker one, it can create a weird little texture where it'll break the ink apart below it. And for the background, I wanted a very slight gradient, and I actually didn't do a very good job with that. That's certainly something that I need some practice on, is gradiating two colors together. I did have the two markers open in my hand, and then I would switch between the two, but there was a little bit more of a definition between them than I liked. So after I finished getting the basic laydown of the colors, I went back in with each marker and just added these little vertical flicks all over the background, all going upward, up and down, so that they did have a uniformity to them. And that just helped it mesh a little bit more. It helped the texture be a little bit more disguised in a way that it looks a little bit intentional and not quite so in your face is a mistake, I guess. But But I always like looking for things like that, little things that I can add new details in because of little happy accidents, I guess you could say. Like the smear on her face, I ended up adding a little bit more of almost like a scar happening. And that's actually really fun for me to think of ways to fix little issues like that. But I'm glad for the background, because if I didn't add those flicks, I wouldn't have liked it as much. And that is it for today. I loved working with something so saturated. That's something that I always crave, is having control over that. But as usual, I do have this little painting available at my art shop. So if you'd like to own this, I do have a link in the description as well as in the end card. And I will actually have prints of her available as well, because I'm actually really happy with how this turned out. But that is it for today. As usual, I have a link in the description that has all my tools that I use. And I do post every Wednesdays and Saturdays. So I'll see you guys at my next one. Thanks for watching.